Welcome to another creepy episode of The Wandering Road. I'm your host, Chris, and today we're going to cover the legend of the Black-Eyed Children. So, for those of you that are not familiar with the Black-Eyed Children, what are they exactly? So, according to legend, the Black-Eyed Children are paranormal creatures that resemble children between the ages of 9 to 16 years old. They're commonly described as having pale skin with black eyes. So, to picture it in your head, just picture a little child with pale skin and take two pieces of coal and insert them where their eyes should be, and you'll get a pretty accurate description of what these black-eyed children look like. More so what their eyes look like. If you've ever seen The Grudge, you could think of them being similar to that little kid from the Grudge movie. Except there's no white in the eyes. It's all just straight black. The legend has it that the black-eyed children can be found begging, hitchhiking, or they'll even come to your doorstep and knock on your door at odd hours of the night. And what they tend to do when they do approach you wherever you are, whether you're walking in the street, in your car, in a parking lot, just, hanging out, or you're just relaxing at home and it's the middle of the night, they'll come knock on your door, your window, any way to get your attention. And what they'll tend to do is they'll start spinning a story of how they need to use your phone, they're lost, they need to contact their parents. They'll try to sell some sort of sob story or some sort of inconvenience that'll, they'll try to get into your home, or two, if you're in a vehicle, they'll actually try to get into your vehicle and get you to take them someplace. What's interesting about the Black-Eyed Children story or legend to me is that when I did a little bit of digging about this topic, it seems to be a phenomenon that occurs more in the United States. I couldn't really find any encounters that have occurred outside of the United States. Now, I may be completely incorrect. This may be an occurrence in other places around the world, but when I researched this topic, it was more so encounters in the United States, and they mainly took place in the early 90s and up until, I would say, relatively recently. But what's interesting is the most credible report of the Black-Eyed Children comes from a Texas reporter named Brian Bethel, and this occurred in the mid-90s. So in 1996, Texas reporter Brian Bethel in Abilene, Texas, claimed to have had an encounter with the Black-Eyed Children. Brian said that he was seated in his car in a parking lot at the time when two boys aged around 9 and 12 came and knocked on his window. Brian described them as one of them having olive skin, curly hair, and the other as redheaded and pale-skinned. And both boys were wearing hooded pullovers. So the boys explained to Brian that they had come to watch the premiere of the Mortal Kombat movie at the theater, but they seemed to have forgotten their money. And they then requested to Brian if they could get a ride in his car to their house and back so they could get the money from their mother. It sounded innocent, right? Just two kids asking a total stranger to give them a ride for help. I don't think that would be the greatest idea. But as the conversation continued, Brian said he was consumed with irrational fear of these children. It's important to note before I continue that At this point in the interaction, for one reason or another, Brian did not make eye contact with these kids. Now, he didn't specify in his encounter whether they had their hoods up or anything like that, but at this point in the story, he has not made eye contact with them. So Brian, overtaken with irrational fear, he didn't understand why he was so afraid of two little boys. They were kids. They didn't have weapons or anything. They weren't threatening his life. But when Brian subconsciously started to reach for the door to unlock it and open the door, for some reason he didn't know why, his hand was moving towards it to open the door. That was when he finally made eye contact with the boys and saw their coal black eyes. Brian described their eyes, and I quote, "The sort of eyes one sees these days on aliens or bargain basement vampires on late night television. Soulless orbs, like two great swaths of a starless night." He tried to remain calm. He gave a few excuses of why he couldn't stick around and why he couldn't help them. I guess it seemed to work because he rushed away in his car, and as soon as he started driving off, he quickly looked back in his rearview mirror, and the boys were gone. So we're talking about maybe a half a second of when he probably pulled off and looking into his rearview mirror, and then the boys vanished. That's quite unsettling to me. The next encounter, also involving a vehicle, takes place on March 17th, 2008. So you could say this encounter is fairly recent, it's 2023, so maybe 15 years ago. So on March 17th, 2008, a 12-year-old boy had a bone-chilling experience in an outlet parking lot. So this little boy was waiting in his mother's truck because she was getting a haircut. While he's waiting in the truck, he looks out the window and he sees a boy walking across the parking lot towards the truck. No big deal. He thinks it's a friend from school. So the boy walking across the parking lot finally reaches the truck and then bangs on the window. The boy in the truck is startled when he quickly realizes that it's not his friend from school. He doesn't recognize this kid. The boy in the truck watched in confusion as the boy outside stared at him through the window. And the boy in the truck caught one glance at the other boy's solid black eyes and knew he was staring into the face of evil. "You must let me in," the black-eyed boy demanded. Panicked, the boy in the car crouched under the glove compartment in the passenger seat. After several minutes had gone by, the black-eyed boy seemed to have gave up and then finally disappeared. Fast forward a few minutes, the boy's mother finally returns to the truck, and she then informs her son that a black-eyed child had come into the salon, forcefully demanding the mother to give him the keys to her vehicle. Obviously, the mother, not knowing who this child is, didn't give in. Thankfully, she didn't, because who knows what might have happened to that little boy. And it's one of those things where if you're sitting in your car, I think most of us have had this experience before. We're just sitting in our locked car. We're waiting for someone. In the case of this little boy, where, we just got back shopping or we're eating something. We're sitting in our locked parked car. You're not really thinking much of it. And it's not out of the realm of possibility that someone knocks on your window or someone being a troublemaker bangs on your car. I'm sure we've all experienced that in some form or fashion. Maybe this little boy probably experienced, some neighborhood bully bothering him, and then he probably thought it was some sort of supernatural occurrence. Can't really say. But the next encounter, This one takes place in January of 2016 in the state of Vermont. So a woman in Vermont made the tragic mistake of letting 2 black-eyed children into her home. So there was a blizzard raging outside when she heard a faint knocking on her door. She opens up the door, and a boy and a girl are stood there, shivering, begging her to use her phone. Unnerved by their presence, the woman nevertheless let them in and went to go retrieve her phone. After the children walked into the light of the family room, the woman then realized that their eyes were completely black. As she stared at them in horror, out of the blue, her husband's nose began to bleed, and at that same exact time that her husband's nose starts to bleed profusely, the power goes out. After what felt like an eternity, the children spoke in unison, saying that their parents had arrived. The woman watched as the 2 kids quietly left her house and entered a nondescript black car with a man in a suit. So not long after this strange encounter with the black-eyed children, the woman's poor husband was diagnosed with severe skin cancer. The woman herself began to suffer from regular nosebleeds and from an onslaught of other medical issues. She's convinced her failing health, along with her husband's, is the result of the black-eyed children she unwittingly let into their home. Now, this is a first encounter I've heard about the black-eyed children where someone actually comes to pick them up. And if you think about the description of the person or thing that came to pick them up, my mind immediately went to Slender Man. So I guess Slender Man might be the dad of all these black-eyed children roaming around the United States harassing people. Now, the next encounter I'm going to share with you all tonight, I found to be the creepiest. And the reason being is this one actually contained physical evidence of the black-eyed children, one could say. So the stories that I've shared thus far of all these encounters, it's kind of like hearsay, right? It's just what people say they experienced. This is what happened. You either believe it or you don't. But in this next story, it's a little different. In early November 2012, so this was 11 years ago, a woman was up late watching a movie with her cat. When it suddenly leapt off her lap, the woman was left stunned as she followed her cat into the laundry room. But the cat refused to leave from its spot in between the 2 machines. Suddenly, the woman hears knocks on her door and figured that, hey, it's still early November, might be some late trick-or-treaters still going about trying to get candy. So the woman goes to open the door, and when she opens her door, she's met by 2 children, a boy and a girl. However, there was something strange about the children. They just stood there, looking into her house. They weren't wearing costumes or holding any Halloween trick-or-treating buckets. The boy suddenly asked the woman if her cat had left, which arose concern in the woman. Because if you think about it, how would they know? Well, maybe if they were spying on her through the window, that's possible. But then the girl whispered to the woman, "We need to get inside." The boy was staring at her and grinning. Feeling fearful, she noticed that their eyes were completely black. The woman quickly slammed the door on the children and then called the police. When the police arrived, they found footprints that led into the forest behind the woman's home. It wasn't until months later that the woman found a makeshift bed in her gardening shed. Now let's think about that for a second, folks. It's late at night, you get these 2 children knocking on your door. They're the black-eyed children. You're immediately creeped out. You do the logical thing, and you don't let them in. Some people stupidly do, but in this instance, you don't let them in. You do the smart thing and you call the cops. The police arrive, they find footprints, and then later on, you find evidence of a makeshift bed in your gardening shed? If I found that, I would probably immediately put my house on the market. There is no way in hell I would still stay there. Is it possible that someone might have been squatting in her garden shed? Yeah, that's within the realm of possibility. But the fact that police found footprints, and then there was a makeshift bed in her gardening shed, this is one of those situations where it's like, okay, we actually have some physical evidence of the black-eyed children, and I would be totally creeped out. I would not want to live there anymore. Now, the next story that I'm going to share had me thinking a little bit as I read it a few times, and you'll understand why when I relay this encounter to you. On November 19th, 1992, a man was watching Evil Dead while his wife and children were sound asleep in their rooms upstairs. It was around 1:30 a.m. when he decided to head to bed after the movie was over. Suddenly, there was a loud pounding on his front door. The man opened the door, and what stood behind that door would change his life forever. There stood a boy and a girl, around ages 8 and 11 respectively. They never looked up at him and were just standing there barefoot in the Michigan winter. Despite his anger, the man allowed the children to enter and to allow them to use his phone. Like I said before, that's the excuse they like to use, to phone their parents. But when he went to lend them the phone, they were gone. It was dead silent for a few seconds, and then he heard the first scream coming from one of the bedrooms upstairs. As he made his way up the stairs, he heard the terrifying sounds of bones snapping and flesh ripping. When the man finally reached his wife's room, he was met by a devastating sight of his wife laying there, mangled in a pool of blood. Before he could act, the children quickly moved out of the wife's room and entered his kid's room and quickly locked the door. Despite the man's best efforts, he couldn't get the door open, so he had to stand there, helpless, behind the locked door while his children are screaming and pleading for their lives, begging for their father to come in and save them. But he's completely helpless. No matter how much he tries to break down that door, for some reason he can't get in. When the act was done, the door slowly creaked open, and there stood the two barefooted children, covered in his children's blood. They stood in front of the man defiantly, with awful grins, and eyes completely black, like the devil himself. So what do you make of the black-eyed children? Do you think they're real supernatural or paranormal entities that are hell-bent on causing pain and suffering to people that they trick into letting them into their homes or their vehicles? Or are they mischievous, troubled youths? Could these stories possibly be vivid dreams or hallucinations that people have remembered and jotted down? Maybe. Or is it possible that people like Brian Bethel and everyone in the encounters made the whole thing up for publicity? Were these just creepypastas that were recently created by creative minds that conjured them up for a good scare? Or, what's even worse, especially with the last encounter in 1992, with the man claiming that the black-eyed children killed his family, was this story spun by this man of black-eyed children killing his family to be used as an excuse to cover up a heinous crime? That's the first thing that came to my mind, trying to find an excuse or a cover-up for something completely awful that he might have done. Now, I'm not accusing anyone of anything, but that's something that definitely came to mind. And again, I'll ask, what do you make of the black-eyed children? Do you think they're real? Do you think people are making them up just for fun? You know, a good campfire story? Or is it something that we don't fully understand? But whatever you believe, I'll leave you with this. If it's late at night, you hear a knock on your door, you open your door, and you see children with coal black eyes demanding to enter your home. Just be very careful to not let them in, because you or your loved ones might not live through the night. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of The Wandering Road. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and share with your friends. I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to you joining me for the next one.